Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to start our meeting now, and I want to begin by welcoming you all. It's a Pasadena Group monthly presentation of the Sierra Club, and my name is Bill Joyce. I'm the chair of the Pasadena Group, and we are very happy to have Shannon Ray here tonight as our speaker. And she's going to present a program, and it's entitled 100 Years in the San Bernardino Mountains. And we'll hear a lot about the history of the first settlers in the area, and about, mule rides and up Vivian Creek, if you've ever hiked up Vivian Creek, to the San Gorgonio Wilderness, and the floods in Mill Creek Canyon. Periodically wipe out everything. Shannon is a media professional and the author of the book Pioneers of Mill Creek Canyon, and we're raffling off a copy of Shannon's book at the close of her presentation tonight. So before we start our program, I'd like to highlight some of the ways that you can find out more about the Sierra Club. The Pasadena Group is part of the Angeles chapter. The chapter is bigger than we are. They cover most of LA County and all of Orange County. So the chapter also has a lot of outings, and they are mostly open for everyone, including non-Sierra Club members, and you can check them out anytime by visiting the chapter's website. This is a slide of our website, the Pasadena Group website, and that's where you can find out about our outings, and also conveniently link to the chapter website for all those other outings that I talked about that are being offered by the Angeles chapter. The chapter publishes 2 newsletters on a regular basis. The Southern Sierran is online. There's another newsletter that is oriented towards some of you who are new to the Sierra Club, and it's called SoCal Now. And it comes out quarterly, and it too is available online. It's also available in print if you join the Sierra Club. So when you visit the Angeles chapter website, you can click on News at the top of the website, the menu bar, and you'll have access to the latest editions of both SoCal Now and the Southern Sierran. George Vine is our programs chair, and he's going to introduce Shannon.
Shannon Ray is a media professional and the author of the book Pioneers of Mill Creek Canyon, which we're auctioning off, and there's several copies over there if you'd like one. Her aunt was the classic film star Fay Wray of King Kong fame. Shannon has had careers in music, publishing, and media, traveling the world as a broadcast journalist and a producer for major networks for more than 30 years. After returning to her hometown of Forest Falls, California, she spent a decade researching the history of Mill Creek Canyon. She writes and lectures about this uniquely historical and environmentally sensitive area. Won't you please join me in welcoming Shannon Ray to the club?
Let me just get my presentation back. One moment. There we go. Thank you for having me this evening. I know I'm from a little bit outside your Pasadena purview. Way over there in those other mountains, in San Bernardino Mountains. As George said, my name is Shannon Ray. I grew up in Forest Falls, and in 1841, my great-great-grandfather went to Mill Creek Canyon, where I ended up growing up many years later, completely unrelated, to cut 2 trees. And he was a member of the Mormon Battalion who marched from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to San Diego. By the time they got to San Diego, they were meant to fight the Mexican-American War, but the war was already over when they arrived. And so he was a brickmaker. If anybody's been to Old Town San Diego and walked the brick streets, those are my great-great-grandfather's bricks that he made and that were laid in San Diego. But after they did some work and infrastructure in San Diego, they were sent to Fort Moore in Los Angeles. And my great-great-grandfather, who I'm going to introduce you to in a few minutes, came up to Mill Creek Canyon with a detachment of soldiers from Fort Moore to cut 2 trees. That was all, just 2 trees, to be lashed together as a flagpole. And on that flagpole made of those 2 trees, the American flag was raised over Southern California at Fort Moore for the very first time in 1841 on July 4th. So I have an interest in Mill Creek Canyon's history, and that's one of the reasons why I do. But as I was thinking about this presentation, I thought, and I was looking back over kind of the long lens of time, there's a long cycle, and Mill Creek Canyon is exemplary of it, of doing kind of a wholesale wasting of natural resources, and then coming back around and trying, wait a minute, we want that back, trying to restore those things. And so that was what I chose for my presentation for you tonight, was kind of wasting the wild, the ways that we've wasted the wild. And Mill Creek Canyon has been one of the very first places in the southern part of the states where that cycle began. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. How many of you have done the hike up San Gorgonio? Wow, impressive. I didn't think there would be that many. As we know, Mount San Gorgonio is our tallest peak in Southern California at almost 11,000 feet. And it's a pretty good walk, as anybody who's done it knows. And that's part of the trail going up there that you may recall. It doesn't look like that to you when you're doing it, I bet, though, right? If it did look like that, you probably wouldn't do it. I don't know. But to get there, you have to go through here. This is Mill Creek Canyon. This is from Morton Peak, which is at the very western end of the canyon. And as you can see from this perspective, it's quite steep going up. And when you get up to the end of it, that's when you get to Vivian Creek Trail, past Big Falls at the very end of the canyon, and then start your ascent up into San Gorgonio. So Mill Creek Canyon, this canyon is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And you've been there if you've gone to San Gorgonio. Now, historically, this was the territory and remains the traditional territory of the Uhaviatam people. Now, the Uhaviatam people now are known as the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and we hear a lot about them because they're buying up a lot of things in the wilderness and returning those things to their tribal holdings, which is great. And it was the site of many firsts in Southern California. In our history, it has the dubious distinction of being kind of one of the first places where wholesale wasting of natural resources actually happened in Southern California. These guys are actually Mojaves, but they are related. They are a related group to the Uhaviatam. And this is one of the first earliest pictures of indigenous people around our mountains. So I chose it just to kind of give you a sense of them a little bit. They lived in the valleys. They lived in houses called reach, which are kind of these rush houses down in the valleys. They didn't really live in the mountains because during their more than 2,000 years of history in our state, they had the luxury of kind of staying in the warm valleys during the winter and the spring, and then in the summertime, they would go up into the mountains, fish and hunt and stay in the cooler climes there. They made kind of temporary houses out of cedar bark in the mountains, and they would stay there until the fall. And in the fall, they would collect acorns and pine nuts and bring them back down and keep them in granaries down in the valley to dry, and had a very long process. But they were one of the few tribes that actually had a very consistent food source. They were quite healthy, and that was because they had the acorns. And they would make a kind of a tortilla or a porridge out of them, and it was the staple of their diet. So they would go up into the mountains to do that cycle every year. This is a strange feature in Mill Creek Canyon. And it's called Bear Shaman Rock. And it doesn't look like it from this picture, but that piece of stone is about 40 feet tall. And the legend around this stone is that there was a bear shaman who could turn himself into a bear. He was a man who could become a bear. And he was threatening people up by Strawberry Creek and Arrowhead Springs in that area as they were going up on their gathering trips trying to get their acorns and their pine nuts. And so somebody decided that they had to do something about this person because he was in the middle of stopping them from getting their food source. So a warrior went up and he shot an arrow. The bear shaman turned into a bear. The arrow pierced the bear, and the bear started running. And he was trying to get back to the bear shaman village, which was Ukaipa, and across Ukaipa Ridge. It was the home of the bear shaman people. And as he ran and came through Mill Creek Canyon, he died right here and remained in the stone. So I'll show you. This is an ear and a snout and a mouth and the two eyes, the haunches here. So a bear in stone. And this is a very sacred site for the Uhaviatam. They still come back here every year on their gathering trips, and they do ceremony there, and there is a burial ground around the stone. And it's across from the Thurman Flat picnic area in Mill Creek Canyon. But the Uhaviatam believed that bears were their ancestors. And so they didn't kill bears, they didn't hurt bears, they didn't hunt bears, they didn't use furs from bear, and they didn't come into Mill Creek Canyon. Why? Because Mill Creek Canyon was filled with grizzly bears. And so it remained kind of untouched for a very long time because of the bear population there. And then our grizzlies, sadly, when the Spaniards came into the territory and brought their cattle, because most of Southern California, as we know, was big leather manufacturing, beef manufacturing with the Spanish. And what would be better for a grizzly than a nice cow snack? So as soon as there were cattle around, there were grizzlies around, and they were starting to get into the herds of cattle. And it became a kind of sport for the vaqueros to lasso and hunt the grizzlies and bait them and torture them and then kill them. And that was a sad period in the grizzly life. And in November of 1841, the first party of Americans arrived in Southern California, the Rowland Workman Party. William Workman and John Rowland. And with them was a 22-year-old carpenter named Daniel Sexton from Louisiana. And Sexton hired out immediately in arriving in the territory to the Chino Rancho and was starting to cut lumber for them for building projects because they were building out the Chino Rancho at the time. And he traveled into Mill Creek Canyon and the area in 1841 and described actually seeing on one day 50 grizzlies around one chokecherry bush in Mill Creek Canyon, and he gave testimony later on in a water case saying, that the native people were terrified of going into the canyon because of the bears, and he understood why, because there were a lot of them. In the 1850s, it was apparently a craze in Southern California to keep and raise grizzly bear cubs as pets. So one has to wonder how that worked out when they became adult bears. In the 1860s, the first settler here in this picture, this is Peter Atticus Forsey. He braved the bears and the elements. He was a famous hunter, actually kind of a Renaissance man. He was from Virginia, from a very old Huguenot family. And he and his family made their way to Indiana. He became a printer there for the Indianapolis Star newspaper and got a law degree. And then the whole family pulled up stakes and went to the gold fields in 1852. Well, he tried mining a little bit, but he just didn't have the temperament for it. So he became the market hunter for the city of San Francisco. And the roster of his kills are legendary, 500 bears and 700 deer and this kind of thing. So he was sort of a famous hunter, and he wasn't daunted at all about moving into Mill Creek Canyon in the 1860s. Anybody who's been up to the Barton Flats area, who knows the camps around there, and Eric's nodding, knows Forsey Creek, and some of you may have hiked along Forsey Creek. Well, this is the man who gave his name to Forsey Creek, Peter Atticus Forsey. He also hired out as a guide, because he was the only person actually living in Mill Creek Canyon. He and a friend who homesteaded there. And they, in their great settler arrogance, said, yeah, you take the upper half and I'll take the lower half, and we'll just split it up between us and it'll be ours. And they had it that way for about a decade, actually, until surveys started to happen and the state said that they wanted some, and the Southern Pacific Railroad actually owned some of it, and they didn't really get to keep all of it. But they hired out as guides frequently for hunters and fishermen, and they would take parties up into the mountains to hunt and fish, and that was kind of their livelihood. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, there were very few grizzlies to be found in the San Bernardino Range at all, or even in Southern California. This story talks about Daniel Sexton in 1906 reported that he had killed so many grizzlies that he had 10 tons of bear meat piled up in front of his cabin. So wholesale slaughter of the grizzlies went on. The last known grizzly, the last known grizzly in Southern California was killed in 1916, shot by a farmer. But it wasn't just grizzlies that had been hunted out. All bears basically disappeared from the range. In 1909, Mrs. George Burris and a group of ladies encountered a black bear. Nobody had seen a bear in years and years and years, and this one apparently did not offer to molest them, according to the article. It was the first bear of any kind to be seen in the San Bernardino Range in over a decade. And in 1933, San Bernardino businessman and a Los Angeles oil baron they decided, well, we don't have any bears, we need to get our bears back. We'd gone through this cycle of kind of wholesale slaughter until we reached extinction of the bear that graces our flag. And then they thought, well, I guess we need bears back. Maybe we need some bears. So they arranged to have 28 problem black bears brought in from Yosemite and released to Bear Valley in the San Bernardino Mountains. And their natural predators were grizzlies. So they didn't have a natural predator, and they were fruitful and multiplied, and their populations spread quickly through our ranges. And all of our bears are descendants of those problem children. These are the members in 1910 of the San Bernardino Pioneer Society. You'll notice the clubhouse festooned with dead animals. Most of them in their official portraits were shown with some large fowling piece where they were the great hunters. And it's kind of interesting to note, and as an aside, in an article in the early 1900s that suggested that if you were going to go out and hunt bear, first you needed to go to the cemetery in San Bernardino and note how many graves said man killed by bear. So the bears did kind of get their licks in too. I like to muse on what our state would look like if the bears had prevailed. Especially on a hot day in the summer when we have visitors clogging our creek with dirty diapers and soda bottles and beer cans, and think, wow, wouldn't it be nice to get some grizzlies back? But over the past decade, there's been a move, believe it or not, to bring the extinct Ursus arctos californicus, that is on our flag, the California grizzly, to life through the DNA of the last captive California grizzly. They propose to genetically re-engineer this bear and release him into our mountains again. Well, we have like a few more people around than we used to. So maybe that bear idyll will actually happen someday if they manage to pull it off. Another natural resource that we saw in a kind of wholesale slaughter in Mill Creek Canyon was timber. Now, Mill Creek Canyon is approximately 80 miles east of the Pueblo of Los Angeles, and we think about the means of travel in, I don't know, 1840, I think that's a significant distance to go cut some lumber. But today was the first time I've actually, since I've been doing these presentations, been close to these mountains here. And I've read multiple sources and documentation about how steep they are, not good timber, all of those things. And I got to see it for myself. It's all basically scrub up there, and it's very steep. So Mill Creek Canyon, even though it was 80 miles away, you could walk right into it without much effort at all. There wasn't a lot of elevation at the bottom of the canyon, and it was really the first place that met the valley floors with real timber. So this verdant valley, with its abundant water and deep forests, had the easiest access. But it would undergo some pretty dramatic changes. When the Spanish missionaries founded an outstation of Mission San Gabriel in the San Bernardino Valley, it's still known as the Asistencia there, they discovered this canyon filled with great pine and oak, and they could easily walk into it, and it would become called Mill Creek Canyon. In 1832, this man, William Wolfskill, was a trapper from the east. He came into the territory quite early, was one of the first Americans in Southern California, and he received a permit from the Spanish government to hunt sea otter. Well, to hunt sea otter, you have to have a ship, and he had come overland. Spanish fathers told him that where he could get good pine, and that was in Mill Creek Canyon, because they had been cutting out of there to build their Asistencia. So he took a crew of native sort of acolytes from the mission into Mill Creek Canyon in 1832 and cut timber and hauled it down to what's now San Pedro, into the port of Los Angeles, to start building a ship. Now that doesn't seem very interesting, really. This guy builds a ship. But at that point, there were no ships sailing the West Coast built out of virgin timber. All of the ships that were sailing on the West Coast at the time were made out of salvaged wrecks of ships that had come aground. So this was the very first ship to be built on the West Coast completely out of virgin timber, and it all came out of Mill Creek Canyon. It was named El Refugio, by the way. Oh, this handsome, hairy man here, that's my great-great-grandpappy, Philander Colton. Yes, his name was Philander. And he's the one who cut these trees for this flagpole at Fort Moore. Now, the first sawmill in Southern California, in the entire southern part of the state, was also in Mill Creek Canyon. Louis Saint-Sauvin, also known as Luis Vignes and Don Aliso, owned the El Aliso winery in the Pueblo of Los Angeles. El Aliso was this giant sycamore tree that grew right in the middle of his winery, and so it was named after that tree. In 1841 was a big year. He tasked his nephew, who was recently arrived from France, with building a sawmill because he needed oak for his casks for his wine. And so they started building in 1841 a proper sawmill at the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon, operated by water, by Mill Creek, to start milling casks. Well, they got it built. It took them the better part of 9 months to get all the equipment shipped in, hauled out there, everything done. They had it operating, and then a flash flood came and buried the whole thing in rocks and debris. And you'll note that that's a big part of the history of Mill Creek Canyon. Flash floods, anybody tries to start something, flash floods come and take it away. But he did that, and then it took him until about 1843 to revive it, to dig it out, to get the equipment back out, and to start it operating. And it operated for about 10 years, actually. And Vignes Mill was still in operation in 1853, being run by Daniel Sexton, interestingly enough, when Amasa Lyman and Charles Rich, these two fine gentlemen here, brought 230 Mormon settlers into the San Bernardino Valley. And the first thing that they realized was they needed some habitations for their settlers. They were a little more permanent than the wagons and the tents that they had. And so the first thing that they needed was lumber so that they could build their new city in the San Bernardino Valley. So Lyman and Rich, shortly after arriving, shortly after they arrived, sent a crew up Mill Creek Canyon, which is boulder strewn and at the time was thick like a jungle with vegetation. Build a road up there. They found a spot for their mill site that was beyond where Sexton's mill was so that they had kind of uninterrupted timber to grab. And the crew came back and said, "Are you kidding? We can't build a road up there." They said, "Do it anyway." And they did, and they built a second mill up in Mill Creek Canyon. And ultimately, that was the beginning of the end for the old growth trees in Mill Creek Canyon. Now, the Forest Service, in 1900, this was kind of a typical view of Mill Creek Canyon. You see stump, stump, tree, stump, stump, tree, stump, stump, tree throughout the whole canyon. And this photograph actually was taken about a mile from the end of the canyon. So even up to the very top, it had been logged very, very significantly. In 1908, the U.S. Forest Service finally made an effort to reforest the canyon. They sent 5,000 pine seedlings to the effort. Now, a few years ago, we went up to this spot where we saw this, where this tree was growing, and it's still there, and it's grown quite a bit. If you look at the inset picture, it's the same tree. The next resource that they took out wholesale in the canyon was stone. Although many miners filed claims hoping for gold, Mill Creek Canyon never yielded more than a couple of bucks, a yellow glory. I think there was the man who founded the Las Vegas Rancho in Nevada, Octavius Gass, wonderful name, set up to mine actually in Mill Creek Canyon in the early 1900s, and he got $1.92 of gold out of the canyon. But the one thing that we have in abundance in Mill Creek Canyon is rocks. This is an early photo of the entrance to the canyon. If you've driven up there, you notice it's sort of narrow. There's the old Edison plant there, and there's kind of a narrow place, but it used to actually overlap. You had to go around an outcropping, come in like this. It was kind of like a hidden valley in its early days. And this is an early photo of the entrance to the canyon. And you'll notice here the outcroppings of rock. This was sandstone. And the new wealth in California at the end of the 19th century needed sandstone for their grand homes and monumental public buildings. In 1889, this man, George Tyler, with a group of investors, founded the Mentone Sandstone Company to quarry stone on land in Mill Creek Canyon purchased by one of the investors in the group. George purchased this ranch here for his mother and moved her in there, and she founded Tyler's Mountain Resort on this ranch, which basically was just a place to put your tent up in the summertime. It was pretty scrubby and rocky. It was not a luxury resort by any stretch of the imagination. The Mentone Sandstone Company was only in business for a few years, but their productivity actually altered the topography of the canyon very significantly. It widened the sides, basically took out the whole center of the canyon, just cut it out in block after block of sandstone. And the quarry sandstone built this building that was all made out of Mill Creek sandstone. This was the original San Bernardino County Courthouse complex, which was ultimately pulled down and carted away and sent back to the earth when something more modern was required. It also contributed to several massive mansions and public buildings in Redlands, California, which became the winter home of the highest percentage of millionaires in the U.S. in its heyday. By 1900, all of the Eastern industrialist families had homes in Redlands and spent their winters there, and it was sort of the height of the social season, and these massive, great homes were built there. I would imagine, too, probably some in Pasadena. Then in 1907, George Burris, a man from Los Angeles, actually from Pasadena, and his two sons were prospecting for gold near the end of the canyon, which we already know wasn't going to really bear any fruit for them. But they discovered an astonishing discovery: a mile-high, mile-long wall of pure white marble. They ran quickly down to claim this property and set up a town called Burris in Mill Creek Canyon. After securing title to their find and beginning to work the claim, they discovered beneath that gleaming face of white veins of green, blue, pink, black, onyx, blue marbled with amber, and it went deep into the mountainside. The find was compared to the finest marbles of Egypt and Italy, and the supply seemed inexhaustible, of course. Where there had been nothing, literally nothing, but wilderness, a town of 1,000 people sprouted overnight. And soon they built narrow gauge vertical railway to carry massive blocks of stone up and down the mountainside, and built a road up and down the length of Mill Creek Canyon so that they could haul marble out. And the Burris family built a big stone manufacturing or milling place in San Pedro. They had their own spur line on the Santa Fe Railroad, and their marble went all over the place. To house the workers, they began clearing all the trees up there to build cabins like this one and a company store for the employees. And the town of Burris was born. And the marble from the Burris quarry was right on time to furnish massive pillars. They could mill pillars in one piece. The marble was so long and so big that they could mill one pillar out of a piece 25 to 30 feet long. And they were right on time to furnish these pillars for grand homes in Redlands, like this, and Nob Hill in San Francisco. Now, the massive marble find afforded the Burris sons, they were sort of middling. One of them was a clerk in a store, and George worked for the railroad, and they were doing okay, but they were not wealthy people, but they became very wealthy overnight. And so this enabled the Burris sons to indulge a new hobby, their fascination with the brand new automobile. And they inaugurated the Burris Cup Race. And the Burris Cup Race went on continually. Anybody who wanted to do the run to challenge the time for the race could do it at any time. It wasn't a set time. So this thing was going on continuously. And this person actually won in a spiffing time of 59 minutes, 20.5 miles. Now, they had to go across the creek more than 13 times. They had about 15 gates that they had to open and close on their way. And the end of the run was at 9,000 feet. And there was no real road. This is as much road as there was. And it took 4 sets of tires to actually make the run. This winner in his Royal Tourist automobile made the trip in 59 minutes and 40 seconds. Look how modern that car is. The cup race went on year-round. You can imagine the toll that this took on the environment at the time. People running these things up and down the canyon constantly and flinging their tires everywhere. It was quite something. Finally, the county had to shut the race down because they were a danger to themselves and the wildlife and the residents. And Mill Creek Road at that point was deemed the most dangerous road in the state. By 1925, the interior of the marble claim had become too porous to use for building materials, and the quarry was closed. But during World War II, the limestone that was behind all of the marble, and this porous stuff that was back there, was used by the US military for armaments. And I did the work to trace the stone and where it went to. And actually, the limestone from the Mill Creek quarry were in the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So many of the grand hotels and buildings that the marble was used to construct no longer exist. But without question, the defining resource in Mill Creek Canyon has always been water. In the upper reaches, I don't know how many, sometimes people go to do the hike up San Gorgonio and they kind of completely miss Big Falls, but it's there in the upper reaches of the canyon. It's the highest waterfall in the southern part of the state, the unimaginatively named Big Falls. Big Falls used to be called Magella Falls, and it was also called Levering Falls. And it's one of 5 year-round waterfalls that flow in Mill Creek Canyon. And we have about another 5 seasonal waterfalls, and that's in a 12-mile length in the canyon. So the canyon is often referred to as the Valley of the Falls instead of Mill Creek Canyon. Now, this abundance of water meant that the canyon was really a jungle. In fact, in 1907, a man went off fishing with his wife one day, and she was sitting on a rock and enjoying her time, and her husband wandered off, and it took them a week to find him, and he was upside down and gone at the base of Big Falls because it was like a jungle. If somebody walked off into it, you couldn't find them again. And it was overgrown with alders and willows and ferns and vines. But it also meant that the water raced along its length during flood years, taking everything with it, because it's like a giant funnel. The beginnings of the community were sent hurtling down the mountain by water again and again and again. There were massive floods in 1832 and 1842, but the really defining one was in 1861, 1862. And it always shocks me that there are not that many people who know about this history. Because in 1861, 1862, almost the entire state was underwater. There was a series of what they call arc storms, atmospheric river storms, that converged over the state. And the valleys, pretty much all of the valleys, certainly in Southern California and throughout, this is actually Sacramento during that. This is in the San Joaquin Valley, the house floating by. There was 20 feet of water in the valleys, and the only way to navigate the state of California was by steamship. And these lakes, these inland lakes, remained for months. And then that happened in February and March. By the time May, June came around, they became these sort of hot, stinky, fetid swamps that stayed there for a few more months. And the USGS actually models this kind of storm still. Every year they do a new modeling, and it's estimated that if this kind of storm occurred now, because at the time that this storm happened, this series of storms happened, there were 300,000 people in the state. Well, we have quite a few more people than that now. If it happened now, they estimate that the loss of life would be in the millions, and that property damage would be approximately $700 billion. It poses a greater threat to our state than earthquakes. And everything that was in Mill Creek Canyon in 1862 disappeared. This is actually flood damage from the 1916 flood. We had another massive flood that somebody actually mentioned to me this evening, the 1938 flood, which was also very bad. But then we had the catastrophic 1969 flood. And each one of these has shaped the canyon very, very dramatically. The citrus growers and farmers in the valley below Mill Creek Canyon also had a big impact on our future. They argued that they had the rights to all of the water deriving from Mill Creek Canyon and all of its tributary streams. That seems pretty arrogant, right? Like, wait, how can they claim title to our water? And the people who were living in the canyon at the time suddenly lost their rights to their water, even household use water. Because in 1812, the Spanish fathers, when they were building the Asistencia with the help of the Uhaviatam and Cahuilla people, had built a zaha, a channel, kind of a channel, irrigation channel, out from Mill Creek Canyon down to the Asistencia to irrigate crops. And the courts, it went to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that they had the grandfathered right to all the water in Mill Creek Canyon. In the 1890s, another foe arrived in terms of our water, and that was hydroelectric power. This man is Cyrus G. Baldwin. He was a minister and college president and a very unlikely developer of hydroelectric power, but he did. He developed the first DC power and the first short transmission of DC power in San Antonio Canyon near Claremont in 1892. He split off from the people that he was working with at the time and kind of went rogue on his own and decided, look at all this water in Mill Creek Canyon, it's going to be mine! And he was going to supply power to Riverside County by diverting all of the water on the north side of Mill Creek Canyon, including Big Falls, into a flume and into penstocks and into a generating station in Mill Creek Canyon. He partnered with this man, John Dobbs. If anybody's seen Dobbs Peak on a map, this is the man whose name graces Dobbs Peak. And this was his little cabin at the very top of the falls on Falls Creek. And that's where he and his family lived, in this little cabin up on top of Falls Creek. Because he had some water rights claims in Mill Creek Canyon, so Cyrus Baldwin came along and said, partner up with me, buddy, we're going to be rich. All you need to do is dig a tunnel under Big Falls to divert that water. I'm right on it. So Dobbs and his men started digging this tunnel. The tunnel still exists. I don't know if any of you have ever hiked up there and done the tunnel. It's quite a fascinating hike. But they did build the tunnel underneath Big Falls. They built a lot of the flume, and by the time they finished, it was the end of a terrible drought year. And there was not enough water on the north side of the canyon to power a child's toy, much less Riverside County. So Mother Nature got her own back. However, former partners of Baldwin's were busy further developing technology on the lower part of Mill Creek. And this very ordinary, not too interesting looking building, which is still there, and you see it out in Mill Creek if you're coming up past Mentone, from Mentone Green Spot up into the canyon, is where, on September 7th, 1893, the very first transmission of three-phase AC power happened in the world. It was developed on Mill Creek and continues to power our world for the most part. But it required a lot of water. And when the power companies came in, first, we had, you can't have your water, so the homesteaders were starting to flee because they couldn't water their crops. There were 300 fruit trees that Peter Forsey had planted that all dried up and died because he had no right to irrigate his trees. And then the hydroelectric power company came in, and they took the rest of the water out and left Mill Creek Canyon dry as a bone. So although the technologies developed on Mill Creek brought boundless opportunities to the world, the net result for the canyon was devastating. Pictured here in the early 1900s, these are the fruit trees that Forsey had planted that all dried up and died. And by the 1960s, we were having floods that looked like this. We had a 40-foot wall of water that went down the canyon after 62 inches of rain. And it was clocked leaving the canyon at 72 miles per hour. And everything in its wake went away. And I was a little girl living in the canyon at the time. We were trapped there for 7.5 weeks. We had no road, we had no bridges, we had no food, we had no telephone, we had no electricity. They were dropping care packages into us by helicopter. It was very dramatic. Needless to say, if we live in the canyon, we're always prepared now. But the good part about that was that everybody pulled together. At the time, we were a community of only 300 people, year-round. And people took whatever was out of their freezer, put it in a pot, started to cook it, passed it along to the next person. They'd throw something in the pot. So we had flood stew that went the length of the canyon and back, and everybody ate it because it's what we had. There was a huge freeze. We had all that rain, and then it turned to snow. We had 10 feet of snow on top of all the rain, and then it turned to ice, and roofs were collapsing on the houses, and all the men got together, and all the young men, including one of them sitting here, and chainsawed ice off of roofs to save houses. We had a mother with 6 children who burned her furniture to stay warm because they had no way to cook or stay warm. And she said she would sit there night after night and hear the nails coming out of the walls from the weight on the roof. So we all pulled together and we helped each other, and we lived in community, and that's a lovely, lovely thing to experience. And this is now pretty much what Mill Creek Canyon looks like. A bit of a rocky moonscape from that verdant, tree-filled, lush place. But let's not forget perhaps the single most impactful factor in wasting the wild in our San Bernardino Mountains. Since the 1860s, when homesteaders like Peter Forsey and John Skinner and such offered their services as guides to hunters and fishermen, taking them to prime spots in the Santa Ana River and even up into Bear Valley. But in the 1870s, this gentleman on the tall horse, who was a very tall gentleman too, Sylvanus Thurman, began to take burro pack trains into the mountains. And he had set up a sort of, I can't call it a resort, it was a ranch where people stayed because they had to stop somewhere when they came off the stage before they got on a burro at his place in Mill Creek Canyon, which is now where Thurman Flat Picnic Ground is, named after him. And he would take them up into the higher mountains, and he founded this resort on Bluff Lake. Matthew Lewis, this gentleman sitting in front of his cabin, was a former footman on a great estate in England, and he came to Holcomb Valley to mine, but he stayed in a pretty spot that he wandered into one day on a fishing trip, and he called it Seven Oaks, after the great estate where he was actually a footman when he was a young man. And he soon hostled guests and had a growing popular resort. More and more cabins started to pop up, and Seven Oaks Resort was born. And as more and more settlers came into the area, they soon learned that the heat of the summers could be suffocating in our valleys. So the only relief was camping in the cooler temperatures of the mountains. No air conditioning, so you had to go find your air conditioning, take everything. And families would come and camp in the canyon, and they had their wagon, they had their tents, they had all their utensils, they would bring sometimes their cook stove, and almost always a cow. So you had to bring your own cow on vacation too when you wanted to go get cool. And the people who couldn't really afford more luxurious accommodations, like probably these folks, kind of just set up and camped wherever they wanted. There were no campgrounds at the time. You just picked a spot in the mountains and said, here. The very dapper gentleman on the far right is Richard Jackson. He was the son of one of the first 2 settlers that came to Mill Creek Canyon. and his brother-in-law, Tom Akers, standing next to him. And they've decided that on their brand new homesteaded land in 1897, because people couldn't get title to the land in Mill Creek Canyon until after 1897, there was no survey. And so anybody who was living there was a squatter. Basically, they had no title to their land. And so these young guys went off to the office and they homesteaded their own land. And they decided that they were going to open up a summer resort called Forest Home. And this is the stage that they would go down the canyon, crossing the creek 13 times, through all the rocks and the boulders, to pick up their guests at the Barker House Hotel in Redlands, come all the way back up 13 times across the creek to Forest Home in this stage. Mount San Gorgonio was a huge draw for guests. Everybody saw this massive mountain, pristine wilderness, and they all wanted to go up and see what the top of that looked like. And so Forest Home had they capitalized on that. They had a monopoly on it, and they hired out guides to take people up, and every day there were burro rides to the top of Mount San Gorgonio. But if you could kind of tell here, it was dusty, uncomfortable. She doesn't look like she's having too much fun. This is Mr. Vincent, one of the guides. We noticed he had a nice comfy mule instead of a donkey. And he was available to take groups up. And the Vivian brothers, who created the Vivian Creek Trail, were actually cousins of Tom Akers, who owned Forest Home. And he said, everybody's tired of bushwhacking their way up that mountain. You guys have to do something about that. So he hired them to build the Vivian Creek Trail. And they did. And they also hired themselves out as guides to take people up. Forest Home also kept, I don't have a photograph of him, but they employed a full-time trapper at Forest Home to keep all the varmints down so that the guests wouldn't get scared. His name was Joe Rassick. Every week his kills would be reported in the newspaper. And his, I think the top one that I ever found, his high score was 20 foxes, 13 bobcats, 40 skunks, and 3 mountain lions that week. He would have had 4 mountain lions, but the mountain lion actually took the trap that was bolted to the tree and took off with the tree, or he would have had 4. This is Vivian Creek on the journey up Mount San Gorgonio at the turn of the 20th century. I don't know if it looked like that when you went up there, but pretty beautiful, pretty wild still. And Vivian Creek Meadows in 1900. Then with the advent of automobiles and a new toll road into the mountains, the very first toll road, or first road, actual proper road into the mountains, was built and opened in 1914. It was built by prison labor, and there's lots of stories about that, but I won't bore you with them now. And a journalist remarked in that year that there was a car beneath every tree in the mountains. Everybody wanted to take their car on their scenic tour to the mountains. And those who could afford luxurious camping at Forest Home had a spot like this. In 1921, it was noted that, quote, more cars went into Bear Valley this year over the Mill Creek grade alone than visited Yosemite or Yellowstone in the last year combined. Travel totals for that summer for cars going into the mountains were given as 60,000 cars and 250,000 people. And we know that wherever people go, there's a significant footprint on the land. And as seen here, travel wasn't even confined to the summer. This was the White Mountain stage, Israel Beale, and he ran year-round. Now, where the trip into the mountains in the 1870s meant weeks of travel, I actually have a presentation that I do that takes people from the train station in Los Angeles to Bear Valley in 1900, and that was a trip of about 10 days. And it was a dusty thing on the stage, and then back on a burro or a horse for days and days and days, and automobiles sped up the timeline significantly. But this one-lane road, this was the road that they built in 1914 into the mountains. It was one lane, and it wasn't always very convenient. The narrow, sometimes precipitous road only accommodated traffic one way up and one way down. And if you can figure out this schedule, good on you. Because sometimes you could go up, sometimes you could go down, but you couldn't do both. And sometimes you had to camp overnight and wait. It didn't seem to daunt the automobile enthusiasts at all. They'd camp overnight, they'd camp for a few days, they'd wait and wait and wait until the road opened up in their direction. And one of our legendary mountain women, Cactus Kate Harvey, wore 6 guns on her hips. This is her when she was young, but when she was policing the toll road, she was not so sweet looking. And she did actually have holsters and 2 guns, and she wore them, and she would police the toll road, or the toll gate, which was on her property. It was sort of a little cabin thing. And if anybody got out of line, she'd shoot them. I kind of want Kate back. I'm not going to lie. Because we still get the long trains of cars, summer and winter, clogging our road. So with 20 million people at our feet, at the base of the mountains, wanting to enjoy the scenery and the cool, we're kind of nearing a breaking point. We see more and more and more of this, the graffiti on the stones, on the trees. I have seen on sacred sites many times graffiti. And the axiom, take only memories and leave only footprints, that we all ascribe to here, is more important than it's ever been to ensure that our wild places will continue and be enjoyed for generations. As we've seen this evening, extracting from our landscapes for sport, placing it in the service of utility, and claiming nature for the purposes of profit have only afforded us ephemeral progress. The cost is extinction, fueling an engine of obsolescence that leaves us with wastelands. We see these stones being cut out of places like this, building these monumental buildings which are only torn down and thrown away again. But Mill Creek Canyon is an amazing example of something. Nature takes its own back. Whether it's flood or mudslide or earthquake, whatever way she can, she shrugs us all off as she can. And that kind of heartens me. Thank you very much for having me this evening, for listening. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to take them. We also have books over here, Pioneers of Mill Creek Canyon. And I was going to put this up. Somebody was interested in this website, and I have a Facebook group, History of the South San Bernardino Mountains, and do an article every month there. People seem to enjoy that, and lots of good questions about places to go and hike and things to do. Yes. Did you have a question?
There's such a history of floods in Mill Creek. I'm curious if the flood control people in LA County in general have never tried to do anything in Mill Creek?
No, not really. We've had San Bernardino County come with bulldozers and sort of try to bulldoze a channel in to keep the water going in a certain direction, but we have so many tributary streams, and we have mountains on both sides of us, and Ukaipa Ridge is quite steep. And sadly, we were in the middle of the El Dorado fire in 2020, and we just had a death a few weeks ago during a mudslide. A woman was taken out in her house because of the burn area. Now there's nothing to keep everything on the ridge. And so now, with any rain, people are starting to get very nervous because of the burn area. Yeah, even the Seven Oaks Dam. Has anybody been hiking up near the Seven Oaks Dam recently? There's so much debris in the Seven Oaks Dam that there's only about 4 feet to the top from the soil. So if we got even a moderately significant rain, it would be coming down out of there. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate you coming out tonight on our first blustery night.